The Truth and Reconciliation Commission report concludes with 94 calls to action. These calls are subdivided into 6 categories: child welfare, education, language and culture, health, justice, and reconciliation. Child welfare, numbers 1 to 5. Based on the disturbing data concerning the placement of Aboriginal children during the 60s scoop, the 5 calls to action bring attention to the care and custody of Aboriginal children. Education, numbers 6 to 12. Senator Sinclair has said, "Education is what got us into this mess. The use of education, at least in terms of residential schools, but education is the key to reconciliation." These calls range from eliminating educational and employment gaps to providing adequate funding for First Nations students seeking post-secondary education. Language and culture, numbers 13 to 17. These calls point to Aboriginal language rights, call for an Aboriginal Language Commissioner, and recommend university and college degrees in Aboriginal languages. Here at Trent University in Peterborough, Ontario, is the First Peoples House of Learning, whose vision statement declares that it offers cultural services to a diverse community of Indigenous learners, First Nations status, non-status, Métis, and Inuit. It collaborates with students to support their academic success, personal development, and leadership potential. Adjacent to this center is the traditional area where one finds a teepee, a lodge, and a sweat lodge, where Indigenous and non-Indigenous students come to learn about medicines or just to be quiet.
So the importance of having our traditional areas here within the academic institution of Trent University is part of our attempt to, indigenize, to decolonize these academic institutions, these ivory towers that have been places that have, for, as we've said, for generations now, replaced Indigenous culture with what was seen to be, that more acceptable white European culture. And we are here and we are trying to reclaim this space, to make spaces within the institution that are positive and safe and welcoming for Indigenous students so that they can feel that they do belong in academic institutions. But more importantly and interestingly, what we have found with our teepee, where we have social fires, where we have our medicine gardens so that our young people can go out and for just a while feel safe and be, to have their to not have their Indigenous identity constantly questioned, to have somewhere they can feel safe within the institution, to have our sweat lodge so that they can still practice our ceremonies and our traditions in a safe space within the larger institution. But the really interesting part is there's a large number of non-Indigenous students who are now coming to us for counseling, who are seeing the value in our traditional Indigenous practices and saying they don't want to go to the regular mainstream wellness center, that they want to be experiencing their counseling here because it's more supportive.
Health, numbers 18 to 24. These calls focus on the gap between health outcomes for Aboriginal communities compared to non-Aboriginal communities, as well as a call for funding for Aboriginal healing centers and an increase in the number of Aboriginal professionals in the healthcare field. Justice, numbers 25 to 42. The 18 calls to action under justice range from recommendations for lawyers to receive appropriate cultural competency training, and for all law students to take a course in Aboriginal people and the law and the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which was adopted in 2007 by the United Nations General Assembly.
Well, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is of extraordinary significance to this country. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission defined it as the necessary first principle of reconciliation, that in fact it has to be a rights-based framework that guides us on our path moving forward. Secondary to that, over the last year and a half, 2 years or so, there's been a couple very significant steps. A, the Government of Canada fully endorsed or fully adopted the UN declarations at the UN. And two, there's recently been a bill that's been passed, third reading in the House of Commons, that says all laws of Canada have to be brought into conformity with the UN Declaration. What that says is that there are laws on the books right now that are run contrary to a rights-based agenda that run contrary to a fundamental set of human rights principles that are designed to protect Indigenous peoples from the ongoing forced assimilation, ongoing genocide, ongoing destruction of their cultures. The UN Declaration was a fundamental guiding principle that guided many of the operations of the TRC. Commissioner Wilton Littlechild was one of the primary architects of the UN Declaration at the international level. The recommendations or the calls to action that were issued by the TRC were largely informed by the UN Declaration. And now as we begin to implement reconciliation, we have to understand that that UN Declaration is the filter through which we have to understand the calls to action. We can't implement those calls to action without fully understanding those UNDRIP principles and how those apply in a good way.
Also under Justice, numbers 35 and 42 call for more Aboriginal healing lodges in the federal correctional system and a commitment to implement Aboriginal justice systems. The last group of calls to action from 43 to 94 touch on the theme of reconciliation. Number 50 calls for the establishment of Indigenous law institutes.
So the 26th and 27th and 50th calls to action are about Indigenous peoples' own laws. So as we've seen, Indigenous peoples use their own laws in entering into treaties with the natural world around them, entering into treaties with one another, and entering into treaties with the Crown. And these laws are critical because they set standards for judgment about how we should behave today. So these laws aren't just a once upon a time idea of how we should live, they're constitutionalized. The court has said in Section 35 of our Constitution that treaties are intersocietal law, and that if we want to understand the treaty, we have to look at both the common law and Indigenous law. You only understand what Canadian law is by the interaction of the common law and Indigenous law. And so these calls to action recognize that our country is built upon Indigenous law, but that it can also be a contemporary force for answering questions today. So at the University of Victoria, we've launched an Indigenous law degree. So students can learn Indigenous law all through their 4 years together, and they'll get a joint degree, a JD, which is a common law degree, a JID, which is an Indigenous law degree, and the students will learn comparing and contrasting Indigenous and common law traditions throughout their 4 years in the school.
Calls 53 to 61 range from the establishment of a National Council for Reconciliation to a call for church parties to the settlement agreement to fund reconciliation and cultural revitalization projects. Number 59 calls for church parties to the settlement agreement to educate congregations on why apologies are necessary. At Church House, the National Office of the Anglican Church of Canada, Anglican Video is producing a documentary on the Doctrine of Discovery, which will be distributed to parishes, theological colleges, and universities to examine attempts to colonize the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people of Canada.
It's an educational piece around helping Anglicans across Canada to understand the history of the Doctrine of Discovery, how in fact it was imposed, and the implications and the sad legacy of that doctrine. That's what this initiative is about. It's primarily an educational initiative. And it's a follow-through from a resolution we adopted as a General Synod in Halifax in 2010. And when the calls to action for the TRC were issued in 2015, 5 years later, it was a kind of reminder to us as a church that we really needed to do a lot more than pass a resolution.
Number 62 calls for the development and funding of Aboriginal content in education. Here we meet Marina Westbrook and Graham Mastersmith of the Ottawa Separate School Board, who describe the impact of this call to action.
It's very important. It's a responsibility. It's one of the calls of action for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and it's a way to help our students move forward. They are truly committed to reconciliation, and our whole staff has put a lot of effort into embedding some Indigenous perspectives into their courses and into the material that they share with their students, and it's helping to move forward. An elder once told me that it took 7 generations to get to where we are in reconciliation, and it will take 7 generations to heal, But this is the generation that is going to start making that change.
So I teach a course in expressing Aboriginal or Indigenous art and culture. And last fall, my grade 9 class watched Gord Downey's Secret Path videos. And after watching that, we decided we needed to do some kind of artwork that would commemorate and honor Chanie Wenjak and the thousands of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis children that never returned home from residential schools. So my students came up with this image, the only photograph of actual Chanie that exists, and they painted him. And then my students initially wanted to find the 6,000 names of students that never returned home from residential school. And we hunted and looked, and we couldn't find that on the internet. So we came up with the idea of writing the 94 calls to action on Chanie's body, and just to draw attention to the idea that children died in these schools. It was a horrendous thing that happened in Canada, and now in moving forward, we're trying to make artworks and draw awareness to the true history of Canada's Indigenous peoples.
Call to Action number 76 encourages Aboriginal communities to lead in the development of residential school cemetery identification strategies. The burial places of many of the 6,000 students who died at residential schools are unknown. The Oblates, who administer the majority of the Roman Catholic schools, want to help.
With this call to be respectful of First Nations is to do with helping First Nations bands who want to collaborate in this to discover the burial sites of their children who had died, those who have passed on during their time in residential schools. So our hope is to try to do this. I know it's going to be very complicated with records, but we want to try to respond to that call in particular.
Call to Action number 87 calls for the stories of Aboriginal athletes in history to be told. Here, the Mohawk Institute in Brantford, Ontario, which we visited earlier in the film, is being repurposed by the Woodland Cultural Centre.
We're refurbishing the building in an effort to preserve the structure itself, as well as to use it as an interpreted historic site to tell the history of residential schools in Canada and the impacts that they had on Indigenous communities.
And in the museum are exhibits that celebrate the famous Mohawk marathon runner Tom Longboat, born on the Six Nations Grand River Reserve in 1886. Largely because of his ability to dominate races with spectacular finishing sprints, he was one of the most celebrated athletes before World War I.
I'm hopeful and optimistic. Absolutely. I wouldn't be involved if I was not optimistic. To be in this business, you have to be an optimist. And you have to be a determined optimist. You have to set a course for the future, and you have to stay the course. And you have to be enlightened in your position. You have to be able to educate and inform, not just the community you represent, but the entire nation, that what we are seeking for ourselves will strengthen the nation. We would add much to the diversity of Canada. We would add so much to Canadian history, because a large part of what is taught in the schools is not Indigenous history. Right? It has very little to do with Indigenous history. It's about England, it's about France, it's about other peoples. And that's not a truthful story. That's not the full story of Canada. It will only become the full story of Canada if it includes the Indigenous piece. And I'm really pleased that there are many, many schools now in different parts of the country that have proceeded along that line. And they describe it as the indigenization of this institution or that institution. I think that's a positive step forward. And once we are able to give full definition to what we mean by indigenization, I think we're going to be well on our way.
I am 3/4 Mohawk, and my Mohawk name is Ilioyantne, which means she brings a message. I'm happy all the other kids are wearing orange t-shirts because it helps them to understand what happened at the residential schools a bit more clearly than like what you might learn in a classroom.